This is a podcast by the News Minute, and you are listening to South Central.
Hello and welcome to South Central, a TNM podcast where we put the South at the center. I am Dhanya Rajendran, your host. Remember, South Central is a podcast that drops every Friday where we discuss two stories, mostly from southern India, and then we look at the headlines from the South. We have guests joining us every week. So don't forget to make South Central your weekly listen, or rather your weekend listen. And welcome to the show again, Anisha Sheikh, my co-host for the week.
For the last time.
For the last time, we cannot say, because if I go on leave or Pooja goes on leave, you have to still fill in, right?
Yeah, okay, for the current cycle.
Yes, but Anisha, you should be super happy that you are actually the co-host for the 50th episode of South Central.
That I am actually.
So, for people who have been sticking to South Central for 50th episode, thank you very much for that. And for others who have just discovered us, keep discovering, keep listening more. In fact, my colleagues, the CEO of News Laundry and the News Minute, Abhinandan Sekhri and Vignesh Vellore, had been telling me for at least 2-3 years to begin a podcast. Do you know how much work it is? Because we have to decide 2 topics, then look at the guests, then figure out the headlines, research for the topic. So I did not want to do this. For the longest time, I avoided it. But then there was no option out and we started South Central. But I'm glad we did, because I believe we have built a small and nice community of people who write to us, who listen, who watch us on YouTube. So thank you for that. And don't be shy. Do contribute to the South Central Fund. The link is there in the description, because that's how we keep going. In fact, it was because all our listeners, readers pitched in that we could build this studio. The first episodes of South Central, Pooja never used to have a proper mic. And then people started saying that we'll give for Pooja's mic, and they contributed. So do pitch in. It really helps us a lot. In this week's episode, we speak to an IAS officer from Kerala on the state's announcement that extreme poverty has been eradicated. And then we look at New York and Mamdani's win. Okay, before we go to the headlines, announcements, Sudipta Wandal's long reporting project is finally out. It's on the homepage of the News Minute. It's split in 2 parts. It's about the Tirupura-Kundram Hill in Madurai district of Tamil Nadu, which the BJP and other Hindutva groups are calling the Ayodhya of the South. The story is called Ayodhya of the South, a timeline of time immemorial. That's the first part. The second part is also out. That's called Tirupura-Kundram Hill, a Sang's South rehearsal. Now, when you listen to this headline, you might think that the story is just about how Hindu groups, including the BJP and the Hindu Munani, are trying to capture the Tirupura-Kundram Hill. The court, of course, has ruled in favor, at least one judge has ruled in favor of the Hindus. But the story goes beyond that. In fact, Sudipta's story really looks at how the administration, the police and the bureaucrats of Madurai started the first signs of trouble, even when the Hindutva groups had not entered this conversation. So the questions he asks is, why are the police and the administration under the DMK acting like this? Why were they not taken into control? Why were they allowed to do some of these things? There's also a discussion that me and Sudipta had about a story that's also there on TNM's YouTube. Do watch that. Do read the story. It took months and months of reporting. And I also want to thank a TNM subscriber. He doesn't want us to take his name, but he helped Sudipta throughout all his reporting trips. He made sure that we got transport, we got accommodation. Without his help, perhaps the story wouldn't have been possible. So thanks to the TNM subscriber. Now on to the headlines, Anisha.
Okay, so we'll start with Kerala. After a 2-year gap, Kerala receives a 92.41 crore from the union government for education. So Kerala's education minister V. Sivankutti has said that the funds were released under Samagra Shiksha Kerala scheme and are part of a 109 crore set of funds approved by the union government for educational purposes. Next, we have cooperative scam allegations rock BJP in Kerala ahead of local body polls. So there's been a spate of alleged cooperative society scams in Kerala, in Thiruvananthapuram, and this has put the BJP on the back foot with local body elections just around the corner.
So I just want to just say one thing before you go to the other headlines. In 2021, Harita had done the story. It was called the RSS as a long-term plan in Kerala. It's building local economic communities. So cooperative societies are is one way in which the CPIM had huge control over local economies, right? And they've also been rocked by various financial scandals. So the BJP and the RSS in the last few years have focused on cooperative societies. And they've been building these societies. So Harita's story actually looked at how this is part of that political chessboard of the BJP. So do read that story. The link will be in the description. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so next we go on to Tamil Nadu. Vijay is CM candidate, will make all the alliance decisions. TVK passes a resolution. So the announcement was made at the TVK General Council meeting, and it comes amid invitations of forming an alliance from the AIADMK, and Vijay has also accused the DMK of hateful propaganda and meaningless slander after the Karur stampede.
So did you just laugh while reading out the headline?
Yes, because irony just died a million deaths, to use a cliche. And I don't even know how this man can become CM candidate. Like, his party.
I think it's interesting. So two observations here. One is that for some days now, Vijay's party has been saying that, we won't form alliance. EPS has been saying that we are not talking to Vijay. We have been writing in Power Trip that there have been talks. EPS has been talking. EPS or EPS's people have been talking to Vijay's people. So from the announcement, there are two things, right? One, Vijay is open to alliances. Who is it going to be with? We don't know whether it's AIADMK, BJP, or a different third alliance. But the problem in the fact that Vijay is pitching himself to be the CM candidate, he cannot be with the AIADMK then. Because there is no way that EPS is going to vacate that chair for Vijay. Personally, I think Vijay is going to climb down. He will agree to the AIADMK alliance and not be the CM candidate. Just a hunch, but things can rapidly change. Yeah.
Okay, let's see how your hunch plays out. So next we have the DMK challenges ECI's special intensive revision in the Supreme Court on 65 grounds. Now this one I'm damn curious to find out how the court is going to look at it. So the DMK petition has said that the SIR in Tamil Nadu will illegally disenfranchise lakhs of genuine voters through unreasonably short timelines and stringent documentation requirements.
So we already had a South Central last week with Yogendra Yadav, where he explained exactly what is the problem with the SIR and how it has changed from what happened in Bihar to now. The Election Commission of India has made some changes. So do go back to the episode and listen, especially if you are from Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Puducherry, Gujarat, West Bengal, etc. These are the states and union territories where SIR has already rolled out. The DMK has gone to court while a petition is already pending in the Supreme Court, which has challenged the constitutionality of the SIR. The DMK's petition is also quite elaborate. There's one more headline of the Coimbatore gang rape. Quickly, we'll go through that.
Yeah. So the Coimbatore gang rape, two accused have prior cases for murder, robbery. Police say the two of the three men arrested for the assault and rape of a 20-year-old student near Coimbatore Airport are repeat offenders with multiple pending cases, including murder, robbery, and extortion. So the two accused were caught after a brief gunfight, apparently, in Tudiyalur.
So I just want to make two quick points about the Coimbatore gang rape. First is the Guna, Satish, and Karthik, the three accused, were arrested, but it is pretty shocking that this happened in Coimbatore and near the airport, that too. But I just want to add that there was a press meet called by the Coimbatore Police Commissioner, and the media asked such nonsensical questions. There was a male reporter who asked whether the woman was found half naked or full naked. In Tamil, he asked, Arai Nirvanama, Mulu Nirvanama. Then there were other reporters who were asking what happened to the male friend or boyfriend who was along with her in the car. And the commissioner actually said that he has not done anything wrong. This was when the cop was way more liberal than the journalists themselves, and so much of talk about what were these young people doing in a car near Coimbatore, near the airport, right? Whatever it is, that is not an excuse to really kidnap her and sexually assault her. And I felt the same dialogue had actually happened in Mysore also, when those two students were out and the woman was gang raped. But in that, if I remember correctly, the woman was not even ready to file a complaint. So I don't think that rape case went any further much. We'll have to actually find that out.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
should. Moving on to Karnataka. The Karnataka High Court reserves verdict on ban on public gatherings without permission. So after the RSS planned to conduct marches across the state, the Home Department had issued an order on October 18th banning private groups and organizations or individuals from assembling in government-run or state-run institutions more than 10 people and without prior permission. So that order has now been, it's the verdict on this order which has been, which the High Court will pronounce soon. Next we have spot a litter bug, earn rupees 250. Bengaluru introduces rewards for reporting public garbage dumpers.
I don't know if they've still announced. DK Shivkumar said he will announce, but the announcement has not come. But by the time this episode is out, maybe. Apparently, a person can complain thrice a day. That's almost like 750 rupees a day that you can make by
Right.
just clicking pictures of waste. It's actually a good job for people who want some extra money. Yeah. Next.
Extra money. Anyway, Andhra Pradesh. Andhra teacher faces suspension after viral video shows students massaging her feet. So the ITDA project officer Swapnil Jagannath Pawar issued a show cause notice to the teacher Sujata and placed her under suspension under the Andhra Pradesh Civil Rules 1991. The things teachers make students do. Next, we go on to Telangana. Sigachi blasts. Why no arrests yet? Telangana High Court asks the state police. At least 46 people were killed in the explosion that occurred in Sigachi Industries factory in Sangareddy district on June 29th. Next, we move on to my remarks about Muslims distorted, says Telangana CM. So he's been, Telangana Chief Minister Revanth Reddy has been under attack from the opposition parties and Muslim groups for reportedly stating that Muslims owe their existence to the Congress.
I don't know if he said that. I mean, in Hindi, he said something like, "Aap Congress hai to aap hai," something like that. But the English translation of it does sound very
But
arrogant.
Congress hai to aap hai means the other.
I
it
don't
means
exactly
that
know what he
only,
said,
right?
but I did see the comment. I went and heard the Hindi one. It didn't sound as bad as the English translation did. Anyway,
Yeah, sometimes things get lost in translation or aggravated, perhaps.
he was actually campaigning at Jubilee Hills where there is a bipole.
So now we move on to our star headline for the day. A Brazilian photo appears as 22 voters in Haryana. Rahul Gandhi says lakhs of votes were rigged in the state.
Okay, so Rahul Gandhi held his third press meet, I think, Mahadepura, Aland, and this is a H bomb, which is a Haryana bomb. So he said that 25 lakh votes were rigged. I don't know about all those claims. I think what the Congress has now proven is that the electoral rolls are as impure, as problematic as they can get. For example, this Brazilian woman, she's actually put out a video yesterday. Her name is Larissa. And she is very amused that her photograph from many years ago has been used. She was 1820. So she's actually telling in Portuguese that, oh, this is my old photo. I don't look like that anymore. I don't know why my photo is being used for a scam. But I saw India Today interviewed one of the women. Her name is Pinky, I think, in whose name was on the Epic ID. That person is real. That person has voted. But somehow, due to some glitch, this Brazilian woman's photo has been used there. As a Portuguese woman, I think. So I'm not very sure about Rahul Gandhi's claim that all these votes were cast or all these were, fake
Whether-
votes. Yeah, because they should have done some ground check as to whether these people do exist and it was just a glitch. But yes, the Congress has, with its 3 press meets, clearly proven that there is a problem with the electoral rolls. And the Election Commission of India has to accept it. SIR has not been a solution for it. That is our new problem.
I was just going to say that SIR is not a solution to fix this problem.
Okay, so we come to the end of headlines on the 50th episode. That was many headlines this time. Okay, so this week on South Central, we look at Kerala. The state has declared that it has eradicated extreme poverty, a claim that has drawn admiration, skepticism, and everything in between. On paper, this is no small thing. For almost 4 years, officials in local bodies went door to door, mapping families, holding Gram Sabhas, and building a list of those who fall through every other safety net. The project has been called one of the largest and most detailed state-led attempts to reaching the invisible poor. To discuss more about how Kerala did it, we have joining us Anupama TV, IAS officer. This is something that we normally don't do on South Central. We don't have bureaucrats or politicians joining us, but this is an achievement which really needs to be explained to people as how it was done. So thank you for joining us, Anupama TV. And also joining us from Bengaluru is Professor Freddie Thomas. Freddie Thomas works with the School of Law in Christ University. He's been associated with the SLCU since 2012. His academic interest is in the intersection of economics and law. So I come to you first. How did the Kerala government go about mapping and finding the families who were decided as extremely poor, families or individuals?
So when the process started, the state was clear that it will be going in terms of the deprivation, the extent of deprivation. So there were 4 factors which were identified. It was like one was safe shelter, second was income, then food, and then the health care. So out of these 4, certain parameters were fixed which would make somebody undergoing a very serious distress factor. So out of these 4 parameters, what are the specific areas which are making a person most deprived? These were identified and the scores, weightages and all were assigned. And in addition to that, there's some specific vulnerable categories like the tribal population, LGBTQ were also identified as a second and third category, which also face similar deprivation, but because of their particular positioning or the marginalization, they would be given better attention. So these categories were identified based on these distress elements, and that's how an initial list was drawn.
Okay, then what happens after the list was drawn? Also, I want to ask that, was the Niti Aayog's index also used while identifying who these families or individuals are?
No, it was not like using Niti Aayog's indices or any existing indices. So it was like an independent exercise done by the state. As I said, like the state was clear right from the beginning that for identifying somebody who is extremely poor, somebody who is like losing opportunities to even sustain, that was the major factor that was identified. So that's why like all these 4 categories, each category of distress factor was also specifically framed for this program. And then after once it was framed, the local bodies were given the responsibility of identifying the people. So it was pretty clear that it's gonna be a very democratic process, a participatory process starting from the local body level, but with the participation of all the other stakeholders also involved. So with this participatory approach in mind, the local bodies were assigned the responsibility, or they were assigned to lead the process also. So this participatory process began from the local bodies, which drew an initial list from the existing list already available in the field. Like there are various lists like Antyodaya Anna Yojana list or other vulnerable factors which would be in the field in the form of any list of beneficiaries. All those were pooled. In addition to that, focus groups were also conducted to identify all the people who could be left out in any of the group. Like the people in the locality know about it, and then they were brought together to identify and make the short list. So this the initial list went into multiple processes. Like initial list was then subject to scrutiny by the Gram Sabha, and then enumeration was done, and 20% super check was done, and ultimately it was placed formally before the Gram Sabha, and it got approved as a beneficiary list in the Panchayat Council or the Municipal Council. That's how the process happened.
So somebody who was, let's say, a beneficiary of the Anna Yojana, they would still find themselves in this list, or that is not that won't happen?
Yeah, it will happen because the base list has people who are otherwise deprived. So out of that, for example, in Antyodaya Anna Yojana, person might be getting food in the form of the ration card and all that. That person might be eligible for food, but that person would still have other distress factors like health benefits, or the shelter was not made available to that particular person. So that would still qualify as a distress factor.
I'd like to ask a question. I mean, how does this approach differ from a traditional top-down model and a welfare scheme of identifying beneficiaries?
So the next step of this process is the one that differentiates it from the similar schemes and all that. So in this particular process, it was not like a single scheme benefit that was given to the identified beneficiary. Instead, it was a micro plan based approach. And this would be a massive micro plan exercise for each identified family. As I said, through the shortlisting, 64,006 families were identified. And then for each family, a micro plan was prepared, like to identify the specific need. For example, that person doesn't have a safe shelter, or the person has a shelter, but that shelter is like it is very old, and it could be it needs demolition. So that was the extent to which the micro plan process involved. And then through the micro plan exercise, for a person, multiple plans were developed. Like for a person might need attention in multiple areas, like the person needs a health benefit, maybe a health insurance or a surgery, and that person also needs renovation of his house. So that micro plan will ensure that includes all these plans. So it was not a single scheme benefit that was given, but then whatever was identified to be required to get that person out of that extreme poverty, all these factors were included in the master plan. That's where the scheme stands out.
So, for example, in a welfare scheme, everybody, like all women would get, say, 2,000 rupees in their account, or everybody gets a free bus. This is very tailored to a person's needs. Somebody needs a house, somebody needs a job. In fact, our colleague Harita had written a story about someone who needed a transplant. So that becomes an organ transplant. So that becomes the first intervention, right? Ms. Anupama, I want to come back to you. If you could just quickly think of a few examples of these personal interventions. But while I give that time, I'll go to Professor Freddy. Professor, you have written about how Kerala's approach has been very different. I want to just repeat Anisha's question to you. When you look from outside, how is this different from this traditional top-down approach?
I think the reason why the state was able to do this was because of Kerala's long tradition of grassroots democracy and grassroots and participatory planning, which dates back to some of the initiatives that the state has taken in the form of let's say Jana Pangalita Paddhati. I think it's somewhere in the mid 1990s where this was initiated. Then of course the much touted Kudumbashree program, which started as a as a women's collective. It was a measure to lift women out of poverty. As a women self-help group who were given micro credits, and then they were encouraged to undertake sustainable livelihoods. So all these played into this, and what makes the Kerala model different is that you look at people not you don't treat people just as beneficiaries, but you make them feel like they are partnering in development, and this ensure that welfare is not just a handout that you get regularly. It is something that allows you or makes you capable to enhance your to a long-term reliance. So you're not going to be dependent on welfare forever. Once you have the ability to, that's why I've also borrowed a term which is a safety trampoline from the former Prime Minister of Singapore. So we look at welfare not just as a safety net, but as a safety trampoline, which helps people to sort of assimilate the benefits of welfare for some time, and that should enable them to break out of the shackles of poverty and other forms of deprivation that Ms. Anupama referred to.
Ms. Anupama, you can tell us a few examples that comes to your mind of this, tailoring that you did for individual needs. And I also want to ask you how hectic has it been, because you're the special secretary for the local self-governing department, but was it also a big triumph for you personally that this announcement could be made while you are the secretary of the department?
Okay, I'll first answer that first question about the examples and all that. Before that, I'll just speak a few numbers about the micro plan also. Like, for example, for the as far as the micro plans which are prepared are concerned, the short-term plans were 77,557, and the medium-term plans were like 36,433, and long-term comprehensive plans were 30,696. I spoke about these numbers because I just wanted to clarify that it is not just one specific service for one family. So for each family, whichever are the interventions under each short-term, medium and long-term plan, that was given. And I'll there are many examples under each category, but then I'll speak about certain things that we handled in the last few days. For example, there are people who are landless, but then they have some piece of land somewhere, but it is like 1 cent of land. So that person has a piece of land, but that 1 cent of land is not sufficient to construct a house. So that's a very specific case. So that person is not called it's not a so-called landless person, but at the same time, he's that land is not sufficient for a house. So it is almost equal to a landless case. So that is a case that would come up to a higher level, that we need to interpret in a way that we need to find a solution for that problem. So I just gave the specific example because the issue was identified at the field level, but then it needed a solution. So it was escalated, and then we ensured that we come up with the solution for that particular problem also. Similarly, and you asked about the example. So one example of a person in Pathanamthitta. So in Pathanamthitta, it's just one of the examples. So that person his health was he was having a very poor health condition. So through this intervention, surgery was done by the health officials, and then after that he recovered. And once he recovered, he was in a position to do a income generation activity. So then the person was included under the Ujjivanam scheme of Kudumbashri, and he could start an income generation activity. So that's a very custom-made or a tailor-made solution for that particular person or for that particular family. So there are numerous examples which I don't want to explain everything, but these are some kind of very customized interventions that we undertook as a part of the program. And as far as the volume of the work is concerned, it was not the work was not concentrated at the government level. It all started from the local body level. And at the local body level, the local body president, secretary, and all the officials and the public representatives, they together ensured that there is a coordination of all the stakeholders involved. For example, for the Life Mission house that is to be given, so that is a panchayat's specific activity. But for a health service, it is that health center is a transport institution for the panchayat, but then there is a medical officer from the health department which is involved. And for giving the food, a Kudumbashri self-help group is involved. So this kind of a coordination for each person, for each family, it happened at the local body level. So most of the work happened at the local body level, and in many cases, civil society support was also given. So that needed coordination. And there were some supports which were given by the other departments, for giving documents like the ration cards and all that. Then food and civil supplies comes into picture. So these activities were mostly concentrated at the the local body level, but at appropriate level. For example, at the district level, under the leadership of district collector and the district panchayat level, district panchayat president's level, there was a level of coordination, frequent reviews and all to sort out the issues that got escalated up to the district level. And at the state level, we had multiple meetings by the Honorable CM Minister and the ministers of the other department. For example, the land had to be identified and given to 2,700 beneficiaries. So the revenue department worked closely with us to identify the land parcels and assign the land parcels and all that. So the volume of work that happened was not just at one level, but it was happening throughout in multiple departments, but then with specific reviews at local body, district and the state level. And as far as the government is concerned, or the LSGD department was concerned, like last few days were really hectic because there were cases which were coming up. We gave a solution, but then that was not a sustainable solution. So we had to relook at the approach for some specific case and all that. So and then we did like a check and a super check of the cases, and then we identify certain cases where the service was given, but that was not adequate. So we had to rethink or give a different service, or different stakeholder had to be brought in. So that kind of a micro level work also had to happen in last few months.
So I've had a small question. I mean, why was this group called extremely poor and not destitute? I mean, it sounds more like, destitution that the government was addressing.
Okay. So the state already had the Agadi Rahita Keralam program. So, and then 2017, this project was revamped. The Ashriya project had an additional element which was implemented in the form of Agadi Rahita Keralam campaign. So Destitute Free Kerala campaign. So this program was already undergoing in the state, and then when this extreme poor eradication program was launched, it was supposed to be a more micro level program based on these categories. So this I think I joined much later, but I believe that the spirit was that we already had that program running, and they were already receiving the benefits under the Agadi Rahita Keralam program. So under these, there will be a different set of beneficiaries who needed micro level addressing. So I think that was the spirit.
Okay, so I want to ask that poverty is not something just static, right? I mean, you all have done interventions. You said there's short term, middle term, and long term. But how will the government sustain this? For example, someone that you gave a shop. I was reading this example of a man, I think in Thiruvananthapuram. He was given a shop to run. He was a Gulf returnee, lost all his money, and then there's a small tea shop or something that he runs now. There are several examples of people who have been given these small occupations. But will the government keep a tab? Like, what is the actual plan? Will the government keep a tab of how these people are faring and whether new people and individuals are coming into this list?
I just wanted to say that one health crisis is good enough to push anybody who has just recovered from poverty back into that cycle again. And most often it is health which is the tipping factor.
So we already knew it, and we learned more about it during the process also. Because as I said, like an intervention was given in 2022 or 2023. But then as we went for the checks and the super checks during the last few months, we realized that was not adequate to sustain the condition of that particular person. So right now we have already announced it like a Tudar Paddhati. EPEP 2.0 has already been announced by the state, and we are already working on developing the guidelines on how to improve the or how to ensure that this program is sustainable, and we'll be focusing mainly on two things. One, the people who are already identified and lifted out of extreme poverty, they need to get a sustained income or sustained living conditions already assigned in the form of different programs that were delivered during the last few years. And the second aspect would be, there are people getting into this again, like each day, due to, as you rightly said, mostly because of the health conditions, or because that person had to go out of income, or the shelter, like a new family came and then that person is without a shelter. So all these factors can come. So this Tudar Paddhati was announced because we wanted to make it into a continuous scheme where the people who are newly coming, they'll be identified at an earlier level and will ensure that they will not fall into this. And second thing, those who are already, the beneficiary base will be under constant monitoring to the extent of lifting them out permanently or sustainably. And then in addition to that, we are also looking at other aspects of the sustainability, having more interaction with the public in a way that there is an identification by the public themselves, or reporting system will be developed. So we are already working on it. This was announced on November 1st itself.
Okay, so I know that you have a very short window, so I'll let you go with just one more question. As an IAS officer, I mean, see, for all of us covering politics, it's really nice to hear that there are micro plans actually made for human beings, right?
Yeah.
And that there are different levels of government looking at these micro plans. But as an IAS officer working with especially Kudumbashree, all the local self-body groups, panchayat, what have your learning experiences been, and how, all segments of the government can really come together if they want something to work?
Okay. So I learned about the microplan process during the Wayanad Mepadi rehabilitation, because I joined the department after the microplan process for the EPP was concluded. So former Chief Secretary Sharda ma'am told me about adopting the same microplan process for the Mepadi. So when we went to Mepadi, I had to learn the entire process. So the entire process that was adopted for the EPP for the preparation of the microplan, we learned the exercise, we formed a team, and we conducted the exercise, of course, again, in a more customized manner, or the stakeholders would be different. So during that process, what we found it really challenging than delivering the other schemes. A template scheme is easier to deliver, right? Because you set the guidelines first, and then we'll see who is fitting into the guidelines, and you just deliver it. But here it's not like that. Here you're identifying a problem, and every problem needs a solution. So I find it not only challenging, but at the same time it is rewarding also. Not for individually. I'm not talking just about my personal experience. The system is working towards a solution and not just giving a service. So in most other schemes, that's what we are focusing, right? We are focusing on the number of services given. Yeah, we gave pension to 1,000 people. That's an easier process. But when you're saying that solutions for the problems of 64,000 people were given, it needs a thorough thinking, discussions, and for each service delivery, multiple stakeholders will come. So for example, an organ donation. So we mentioned about the 7 organ donations that were done as a part of the process. So for one organ donation, the request has to come from one point, and then the organ donation registry at some other point, and then thereafter when the surgery happens, it is happening with a different, the coordination is by a different group. So each identified service needed multiple stakeholder interventions, multiple discussions, and it also the system had to be on toes all the time. It was not you make something and then you forget about it, because you are making a plan and you are monitoring the plan, and you have a dashboard where you are ensuring that the MIS is also fully operational, so that nobody is left out, and you have a proper monitoring mechanism and all that. So I would find it very challenging, and at the same time very promising and result oriented.
So thank you for joining us, Ms. Anupama. She had a very small window. That's why Professor Freddy waited to keep you waiting, because I wanted to finish asking the questions to her and then come to you. So we heard from Anupama how the government worked, how at various levels they intervened. Sounds very good. But my question is, was this easier to do in a state like Kerala? Because you've had land reforms, you've had high literacy. So there is groundwork which has already been laid. Right? So poverty eradication is just built on the groundwork. So is it much more easier, and perhaps looking at a lot of other states, only a state like Kerala can actually do it now?
Well, I wouldn't think it was an easy process. I know much of the groundwork has been already completed. You rightly mentioned about, the kind of social reformation movements that Kerala has witnessed over the last, it was a 5 or 6 decade long process. I think what complicates it is that it is, like I said, it's not a cookie cutter approach that the state has. It requires constant involvement and monitoring by, the local self-government and the local communities and the NGOs, religious institutions and so on and so forth. So I don't think it was an easy process, because what the state has tried to do is not to look at poverty from the threshold of statistics. What the state is indeed trying to do is to give poverty a human context. Okay. And it is approaching this in strictly human terms. So I think that makes the process slightly complicated. And what is required is concerted efforts, good strategies, and not just this. You also need a constant monitoring mechanism, and you need to also ensure that the outcomes are met in the way they are designed to be. I think it is not an easy process.
And we did talk about how to sustain this, right? And she was saying that they have this EPEP part 2. But do you think that it's easy for a government to actually sustain something like this over a long time? Because governments change, people change. That's another issue of governance in India. Though there's an announcement made now that everybody who could have been classified as extremely poor. Also, I did not ask Anupama about the fact that there are tribal groups, etc., who have said that.
Criticized.
Yeah, because she's a IS officer, and it's not like getting a politician, right? Where you can ask these questions. Also, you can't ask political controversies much. I mean, that's what I told her. But I want to ask you that there has been this criticism that tribal groups were not taken into consideration. There are people who are landless. So one, of course, is it sustainable? And second, what about this criticism from tribal groups, etc.?
See, I think it is sustainable, provided the state takes some proactive steps. In the case of Kerala, for example, we need to sort of shore up our state's finances. There needs to be sustained, economic dynamism in the state, right? There has to be focus on productive employment. There's a lot of work that needs to be done on reviving economic resilience in the state. Shore up the MSME sector in Kerala. And then, of course, we have a large pool of educated workforce. So we need to sort of leverage that or tap into that potential. We need to think of, more of knowledge-based industries. I mean, it's a known fact that we are known for, out-migration, and a more recent phenomenon, I'm sure you're aware that a lot of, youngsters are leaving the state in search of better opportunities and higher education and so on and so forth. Yeah, so for this to be sustainable, there has to be a lot of backup efforts by the state in some of the things that I've just mentioned. And not to mention, I mean, it is very important that you look at, generating different sources of revenue, because in whatever the state is doing now, we don't have a lot of elbow space. Our fiscals are really strained. So we need to look at, more revenue or innovative ways of generating, revenues. And all said and done, we also, there is a scope of improving public delivery, systems in the state, right? And I would think that, I mean, for all that the state has done so far to identify, the poorest of the poor, it would really help if we have, some sort of a third party, objective evaluation of what the state has done, because I would really love to see the details of the program, right? Because Ms. Anupama mentioned some numbers and, the methodology that the state adopted. So I recently listened to a TV debate where the state, one of the members of the state planning board said that they've used imaginative, ways of figuring out what the parameters are for this whole exercise. And I would really love to see that in the public domain, along with, the specifics of all these families that have been identified. So it has to be subjected to social scrutiny, and then we'll take it from there. But I think I have to really congratulate the officials. From the top down till the lowest rung for what they have achieved. But it definitely requires social and academic scrutiny.
Yeah, and especially because there is criticism that people have been left out. Tribal communities are the ones which have been raising this, that people have been left out, right? So I think some more transparency on exactly who has been included and who has been left out would also help. I think the list is already out there, but somebody has to do a very clear analysis of who are the people who have been left out and why. And as she explained, there are several schemes. It's not just one scheme. People could have been in other schemes also. Yeah.
So one of the things I found most interesting about this whole thing is that this is a tailor-made approach for everybody, right? And governments usually don't work like that. It's one size fits all, take it or leave it, right? If you don't meet the eligibility criteria, then you're out. So this also raises questions for how relations work between the union government and the state governments, right? Now, in a state, we are looking at the state government, in Kerala, we're looking at the state government having given up the top-down approach in favor of something bottom-up, right? So if you look at this, at the, center-state relationship, how would this affect, are there any lessons to be learned here for the union government in terms of, federal relationships?
I think any attempt by the central government to move in this direction will have to consider the element of community participation and decentralization, without which something of this scale is not easy to achieve. One more reason why this is playing out in Kerala is because people do demand public services, right? And if there is a slip up in delivery, we have sounding mechanisms, and the media and the local community and the local self-government gets involved, and then there is a resolution to that problem. Be it, take for example, recently there was an incident involving medical negligence, right? That was picked up by the media, and then a resolution was found. Be it a high-handedness by a bureaucrat or a government official, or any slip-up that happens. So you're looking at a community which is highly aware, and they demand better public service delivery. And I don't really know if a lot of states in India, or citizens have have the inclination to do that. Okay, so I particularly can quote examples of Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra in this context, and these are some of the states. At least research tells us that people demand better public service delivery, and all these states, if you also see, have witnessed large scale social reformation movements, not just in Kerala.
So that almost sounds like you're saying that, when you talked earlier about the community participation and decentralization, you almost sounded like as if you're making a case for greater control over resources at the state level. Because like, as you pointed out, people demand better delivery of services, and they can only do it with their local representatives, right? If I can go and ask my panchayat member why they didn't do something for me. I can ask my MLA, but I may not always be able to ask a bureaucrat sitting somewhere in Delhi, right? Why my services are not being delivered to me.
Also, the point that you made about the federal structure, I think one criticism for the union government has been that they give money. Like there was this minister who was telling me there's some scheme under the union government for construction of wells. and there's a specification for the construction of the well.
Yeah.
And the minister was telling me in a southern state, we don't construct that kind. And the money will be only given if specifications are met. So the union government has to learn from this, that boss, give money, but let the states decide as to how to utilize it and let them have their own schemes, because every state, forget every state, every district in every state has very different demands. Thank you for joining us. This is the 50th episode of South Central, by the way, Professor Freddy. So this is a special episode for us, and thank you for joining us here on that.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you.
So this week on South Central, we are going to look at a political moment outside South India, outside India, that has caused quite a storm within India and elsewhere in the world. Zohan Mamdani, a 34-year-old democratic socialist, has become New York City's first Muslim mayor and youngest mayor in many decades.
Immigrant too.
Yes, he's South Asian. His win has been celebrated by many, but sections of the Hindu right wing, especially within the Indian diaspora, are furious. They've called him anti-Hindu and radical and worse things. So why does the political rise of an American mayor unsettle India's right-wing groups or even NRI right-wing groups? What I'm most excited about is the fact that today joining us is Prajwal Bhatt. For people who have been following the News Minute, Prajwal used to be our Karnataka reporter, still our Karnataka reporter, because he will keep sending us stuff that we missed or stories that we should do. But Prajwal is in New York and he's been covering the elections and writing quite a bit about it. So Prajwal, welcome to South Central as our New York expert now.
Happy to join you always on News Minute.
What is this? Yeah, New York has gone and elected a communist as your mayor?
Almost everybody I know is getting a copy of the New York Post, which is the Rupert Murdoch owned tabloid that's been writing anti-Mamdani pieces. They have a headline that shows, the picture of Mamdani shown as a devil. And so everybody on the left is actually picking it up in the irony of the rage that is his election has kind of sparked. So it's a historic election because more than 2 million people voted, which is more than what the voting numbers were for the last 50 years. And more than 1 million of them voted for Mamdani, and a record turnout of the voters between the age of 18 and 29. So it was great to see that there was a significant mandate for the socialist politics that Mamdani has been advocating for. You wanted to know more about the Hindu right and their response to Mamdani's campaign, right? So for the longest time, the Hindu right actually did not wake up to the fact that Mamdani has held these views in the past, where he has been critical of Modi, where he's read out notes from Umar Khalid in a protest meeting in New York. So it was only towards the end of the primary campaign that the Hindu right actually organized something that opposed Mamdani. And even then, it did not happen from New Yorkers, because they flew a banner over the Hudson River saying, reject Mamdani, Mamdani is anti-Hindu. But apart from that, there were no real people coming forward and holding any kind of rally opposing Mamdani. So unlike other US cities where there is a big Indian diaspora, New York is a very different city in that the South Asian diaspora is very much Indian, Nepali, Pakistani, Bangladeshi. So it's not just the Indian diaspora here. And actually the small pockets where there is an Indian diaspora, where there's a small number of Gujaratis and Malayalis living, that has actually voted in favor of Mamdani in yesterday's results. If I was going through the neighborhood level voting data just before we got on this.
What, Gujaratis have voted for Mamdani?
Yes, actually the Indian population in New York has largely voted for Mamdani. The Indian population doesn't live in like one particular ethnic bloc. They're spread out across the city. But there are two pockets in outer part of Queens where there's a significant number of Indian Americans living. And actually Mamdani was part of the Indian Independence Day celebration in this corner of New York. And even though there were a few people who opposed his politics, almost all of them were taking selfies with him. So it's that, over the last year, his campaign has kind of swept up a lot of excitement among Indian voters. And in fact, after some pushback in the beginning from the Hindu right wing. There has been actually a group that organized in the name of Hindus for Zoran, which has done many events highlighting the fact that Mamdani is somebody who, is a co-sponsor of a bill that wanted to bring Diwali as a state holiday in New York, and among other things has done so much for the Indian community here.
Tell me something. You said that young voters turned up a lot, right? So what was the aspirational, value for Mamdani? I was reading an article, I think it was in India Today, I'm not sure, which said that Mamdani did a Kejriwal in New York. Basically aspirational, anti-corruption. There was a speech, I think the debate in which he said that my integrity cannot, your experience cannot replace my integrity, and my integrity is not something that you can have. Very Kejriwal-like dialogues, but is that really correct, that comparison?
See, I know that the News Minute in India has done some outstanding work looking at electoral bonds and electoral trust and the funding of political parties. There has been a similar level of interest in looking at the finances of candidates in this election. And this interest is specifically looking at the super PACs that have funded Andrew Cuomo's campaign. There was a report which suggested that Cuomo raised over 40 million, while Mamdani raised only around 10 million, meaning that Cuomo had 4 times the financial muscle of Mamdani's campaign. But and people are paying attention to the fact that the billionaire class is, organizing themselves and taking politics away from them. So, and one of the good things about New York, which I don't know if it exists in many different countries, is there is a matching funds program, which means that if you join the program, the city gives you $8 for every dollar that you raise from small donors, up to a certain limit. So, initially, Mamdani, if he raises imagine Mamdani raises $100 from a small donor, the city adds $800 on top of it and making it a total of $900 for his campaign. So this gave him a head start to kind of start competing with billionaire-backed candidates like Cuomo, who eased into the race, being the front runner with 33%, already favoring him for the mayor, and somebody who had the name recognition of being, governor in the past. So it's, and people have paid attention to the fact that billionaires are, taking away politics from their hands by pumping money into certain candidates. So there's been a lot of discussion into the fact that Mamdani is somebody who has raised money from very diverse sources from small donors.
But is that all aspirational? Coming back to the question, for young people, what is the pull?
I mean, the city is expensive, and Mamdani's core campaign was basically social democracy. So access to childcare, freer and more abundant public transport, some state interventions in the economy. Mamdani is suggesting that the city run grocery stores. So even, and Mamdani did amazingly well in the middle band of the income bracket, which is between people earning between 60,000 and 150,000 in New York in the primary. In the general election, he's also done well amongst the poorer populations in New York. What we can see is that even if you earn 60,000 in this city, then the life is actually hard. You're struggling on that amount because rent is so high, because childcare is so high, because transit costs are so high. So for 2 million people to turn out and vote, and for 1 million to vote for Mamdani, they must have aspired and come for something. And Mamdani had a campaign that was for something and was positive. And Cuomo's campaign was, in fact, mostly anti-Mamdani and did not really have plans for how he can alleviate costs in New York City.
So while Prajwal was speaking about billionaires, I was thinking here, having a billionaire close to you politically is not a problem at all, I guess, considering how the BJP has been functioning over the last few years. And there's been a list out by RSF, the Reporters Sans Frontiers, last week, which called, it's a list of news predators. I don't know if they had it before. It's basically people who work against mainstream media, who make sure they file cases or they try to smother freedom of expression. And guess who featured on the list from India? Gautam Adani.
Not surprising.
Yeah. So here remember all the ruckus in India during the Lok Sabha election when Rahul Gandhi suggested taxing the rich more. And there were so many discussions about it, right? Did that happen in New York too?
See, the Mamdani's plan for all of these socialist policies is basically to tax the ultra rich in New York. And if you speak to a lot of people, I mean, this city is insane because there were bars packed and watching the mayoral debates in the last 2 weeks. And there were bars that were packed yesterday for watch parties for celebrating Zoran's win. So it's a very engaged citizenry. It is also a citizenry that's looking closely at the money. And I think that you can see it in the way they've turned out to vote in this election, that they are rejecting the politics of the past that Mamdani refers to, which is, which is actually a defining battle within the Democratic Party that Mamdani is part of. The socialist wing is pitted against more centrist, more liberal. When you use the word liberal in America, it means more centrist candidates. So it's pitted them against each other, and it is the main question is how to respond to Trump and populist conservatism, and how the Democratic Party can articulate a response to this over the next 3 years. That's the rest of the Trump regime.
So, okay, I have one question. I mean, Mamdani has been criticized a lot for some of his financial proposals as well. What is the commentary like over there in terms of how feasible it is to actually deliver on whatever he's been promising? I mean, rent control is one. And if I understand, if I've got this right, I mean, the mayor of New York, has a lot more power in terms of collecting setting tax policies, basically, right? So they have a lot more financial control over their resources, raising and then distribution of resources. So how do you think, what is the commentary like on how feasible it actually is? I mean, apart from the bad shit stuff that, people have been saying about him.
See, the rent freeze plan that he has is the most easily accessible thing for him as a mayor, because the rent freeze is actually decided by the Rent Guidelines Board, and the mayor appoints the people to the Rent Guidelines Board. So I think that the fact that the mayor has such a power to decide the Rent Guidelines Board, and voters are aware of that, of course. So that is something that he can easily implement once he comes to power on January 1st. But what will be more difficult is where he needs to work with the governor. The governor actually did not endorse Mamdani soon as he won the primary in June. And in fact, there was, a long time where she was non-committal, and only in the last few weeks she has endorsed Mamdani. So he has to work with the state assembly that he's a part of now in Albany to try and get funds out and implement the policies that he wants to that he has proposed. But apart from the rent freeze, it's going to be a battle because but the heartening thing is he's got a 50% mandate, which will help in these battles.
So I was actually reading two interesting articles after Mamdani's win. One was by the New York Times, and I was thinking how different it is from a lot of Indian politicians. So New York Times says that Mamdani was more conciliatory in his tone before the elections, which is he was saying, okay, we will perhaps sit on the table, even if it's about taxing ultra-rich. But the moment he won, he has shed that tone. He's now saying that, look, me taxing the ultra-rich is about fairness, which basically is a tone that I'm going to go ahead with it, right? In India,
did you listen to his speech?
Yeah.
My God. I want him to be Bangalore's mayor.
We don't have, we need elections here first.
Bangalore's mayor, but with more powers to actually do something about local governance.
We don't have elections here. But no, the point is, so here, it's almost the opposite, right? You have people making all these claims in their manifestos. Take the Congress here, for example. For 5 things I can name now itself, which they said in their manifesto, which sounded
there was
revolutionary, rebellious, and nothing word of it.
Nothing has come, yeah. So it's like they've delivered on the guarantees, but the rest of it is just gone to down the drain.
Imagine this guy is just flipping that narrative, right? You are more softer before your during your campaign, and then you shed the conciliatory tone. That was one article I read, which I thought was interesting. The second one was on foreign policy, where they were saying that Mamdani has not spoken a lot about Israel, Palestine, and things like that during his campaign. He has said here and there, but he's not made it a subject of conversation because the election is not about that, right? Though there was a concerted effort to make it about his Muslim identity, what is his take on Jews, on Israel, Palestine, etc. But foreign policy says that because of New York's global profile, Mamdani cannot now stay away from the subnational diplomacy is what foreign policy calls it. So because New York is so powerful and Mamdani being its mayor, what he feels about such an international issue will now play out in the global dialogue.
So, what I found interesting in his speech yesterday is that he's been talking about Palestinians during his campaign, but in his winning speech, he talked about how New York would unite to fight anti-Semitism. And then he was saying he's proud to Muslim, unapologetic about it also, but he doesn't talk he does talk about Islamophobia and so on. But then suddenly Palestine goes like missing from the narrative. I don't know if that is strange or signaling
Prajwal,
or
we
something.
of course don't follow it as much as you do. So tell us.
Yeah.
No, I mean, the thing that struck when you were talking about this is the fact that we have a mayoral candidate like Zohran Mamdani, who represents within mainstream politics a big shift. In the last 2 years, you wouldn't think it's possible that someone like him would become the mayor. And I think that the student protests that happened here in Columbia and other universities had a role to play in all of this, because we really don't know what the Jewish New Yorkers are actually thinking, because even though this is a country that does a lot of polls, there has not been a proper poll with, a good sample size that looks into the opinions of the Jewish community, especially among young voters. Because anecdotally, when I've been reporting, I've found a lot of young voters telling me that they're trying to convince their parents about, their positions, and then Mamdani's positions on Israel and Palestine, because he's the candidate who is the most supportive of the positions of the student protesters. So there was no other candidate that actually, shared the enthusiasm he had for the student protesters. So it's true that in the last few weeks of the campaign that he has spoken less about Palestine, but that I think is the general compulsion of being in a general election, which is very different from the Democratic primary, where he was trying to win over the vote within the Democratic Party. In a general election, even Republican voters are there. So that conversation even happened within the Indian American diaspora in New York, because Mamdani actually went to campaign at the Baptist Temple in New York, and the Baptist Temple has faced a case in the past. Even though the DOJ has now closed the investigation, they were accused of trafficking workers from India on the basis of their caste. So then the Mamdani campaign would have been well aware of this, because this is well publicized. But even then, his campaign went to canvass for votes at the Baptist Temple. So yeah, I mean, it's the compulsions of running for the mayor of such a large city. So in the general election, he did have a big tent, with which he was trying to get votes from.
Okay, so before we quickly wrap up, Prajwal, what has been the misinformation and disinformation in this campaign? As a journalist, you would have watched out for that a lot, right?
Yes, I mean, the Islamophobia in the campaign has been recorded, and the fact that so much of the rhetoric against Mamdani just turned to his religious identity, even though he has never played up his religious identity until very recently. In the first press conference he did was when he talked about Islamophobia and the feeling of being a Muslim in New York post 9/11, and being hesitant to engage in politics. So and also you've seen outlets like the New York Post, which has run consistent stories. Some of it, it's difficult to say, where they've sourced the information from. And this definitely has affected one part of the electorate, which is the far right, both in the Indian American diaspora and also the US far right. But I have to say that the response from the Mamdani campaign, the way they have been on the front foot in kind of responding to some of these disinformation campaigns, has also been good, which also helped that he didn't reach a situation where there was a lot of pushback against him.
Okay. Thank you, Prajwal, for that. I realized that we introduced Prajwal as if he's just sitting in the studio. Prajwal is a journalist who worked with the News Minute primarily. The first person to ever get me a criminal defamation case, and I had to go to court to get bail. But that's not introduction. Prajwal is a winner for Ramnath Goenka, two Ramnath Goenka awards, one for political reporting. Thank you, Prajwal, for joining us here.
Wait, hold on, wait.
Thank you.
Oh, ಯಾವಾಗ ವಾಪಸ್ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇದೀಯಾ? ಅಲ್ಲೇ ಸೆಟ್ಲ್ ಆಗ?
I'm there in December, but permanently I don't know yet.
Okay. So thank you, Prajwal, for joining us. Okay, so since it's the 50th episode of South Central, I had said that I will read out a few letters. So Bhuvan just told me that it's not technically 50. We had done 3 or 4 hafta combined. So I have been doing South Central for more than a year. I just realized that. Wow, to me and to Pooja. Pooja especially because she also has to do Let Me Explain. And Pooja's back next week for Let Me Explain and South Central. Yeah, so I'll quickly read a few letters and you should write to us southcentral@thenewsminute.com. I do reply to all letters, mostly in my mind, and sometimes I do type it out. So the first one is from Parinita. Parinita says, Dear Danya, I came to TNM and News Laundry rather late. I started watching and listening to you from the last 2 years, and I'm very, very glad that news like yours exists in these times. It gives me a great deal of hope that we can survive these times and survive it by speaking truth to power. I like South Central for several reasons, for its focus on the south of India and the detailed granular reporting of events in the south. For the research that goes into your reports, I have to say today my research was poor, and also I was sleepy because we are recording at 8 in the morning and I am not a morning person, neither is Anisha.
No, I am fine, but I didn't have coffee, so...
Yeah, but because Anupama was agreeable only to come at this time, she's also very busy. We had to do it in the morning. And Prajwal is in New York, of course. Okay, so Parinita says that I especially liked your reporting on Kiradi and Pooja Prasanna's visit to the site. Your report on Kiradi, while being informative, was also nuanced, complex and lucid analysis of the politics. If you haven't watched it, watch it. It's on YouTube. With regards to the structure of South Central, I like the length of your newscast because it allows for a slow unraveling of the event. The dialogue is left open-ended because subscriber responses and suggestions are actively solicited. And such a dialogue is the most democratic way in which speech can be constructed. Thank you. So I guess the length is something which I've kept debating, whether it should be shorter, longer. People keep having different opinions, but now I've sort of keeping it to 1 hour 15 minutes, 1 hour 20 minutes, and nobody has complained. I think they put on that 1.5, 2, etc. and listen to it. Have you ever listened to yourself on 1.5 or 2?
I haven't listened to myself for the last couple of episodes, which
You
I should do.
Then you will understand how to talk and how not to talk.
Yes.
The next letter is from Vijayendra Kadalabel. It's a short letter. He says, your work is good and important. Of course, very brave as well. It is sad that we use these words to describe what every journalist should be doing. But it is what it is. Continue the good work and all the very best for the next phase of South Central. Actually, it's true, right?
Yeah.
That you have to call a journalist brave while...
But you know something, a few years ago, I would have disagreed with this view that people shouldn't be praised for doing exactly their job. But in some cases, I mean, to some extent, I'm now like, because people do so much shit all the time, right? And it is so normalized. I feel we actually need to tell people, praise people, acknowledge it when they do something nice.
So here's kudos to all those journalists out there who are doing some fantastic work. I was reading this article in The Wire saying that Hindi journalism has moved on to YouTube while English is still doing long pieces. We are those people who are still doing long pieces. For example, please read Sudeep To's piece. It's 16,000 words only. Anisha is writing on RSS and Lathis soon. Okay, next letter is from Nitesh. Again, small letter. All the 49 episodes have been a breeze, barring the one that had Mohandas Pai. Dang. Yeah, we agree with that. It was an experiment. Mohandas Pai came for South Central and now he's like, I don't like Danya at all. He's always on Twitter saying, quote tweeting me and redirecting a lot of abuse in my direction. Anyway, Nitesh says, look forward to many more Fridays for the new episode drop. Hope you win the Reporters Without Borders prize. Nitesh, thank you for the wish, but I don't think that's happening. But it's okay. Being nominated itself is like a prize for me. Okay, Prakyat says, hello South Central team. It's a podcast I've looked forward to and listened to since its inception without giving a miss. Thank you, Prakyat. If there was a prize for most,
Dedicated listeners.
we will definitely give that to you. It is everything that a traditional news podcast program isn't, that is run by a compromised media magnet. North India centric, male chauvinist, insensitive too, which we are not.
Yeah.
I can honestly go on how flawed others are in comparison. The podcast is invaluable for keeping me abreast with events that transpire back home and making sense of them with a nuanced perspective. This is very different. I admire the fact that you have a diverse panel, even if it sometimes involves the likes of a Mohandas Pai. This makes sure that you are not pigeonholing yourself and the audience. I think we should have one episode like this every 2 months because the memory of that is so stark for people, right? Kudos to you, Pooja Sudipto, for the occasional appearance. He should be a frequent podcast panelist, but to get Sudipto to the studio is a task in itself. Thank you very much, Prakyat. Next letter is from Shreyashi Chatterjee. Shreyashi says, congratulations on the 50th episode. I remember being super excited about the launch back when you discussed it with Abhinandan and the team at NL Hafta. Yes, he had been telling me for many, many months before that. My weekends are incomplete without South Central, and I'm glad that you're experimenting with different formats and ideas, such as having Yogendra Yadav last week as an expert. Bravo to you and all your co-hosts, Anisha. I look forward to much more from the team. On that note, I'd like to congratulate you on your nomination at RSF, and if you do travel to Paris for the ceremony, I'd be happy to catch up or be of any assistance if needed. I don't think I'll be traveling to Paris because
You haven't yet won the award. You haven't
not
won
only that, even for like Oscars, they will tell everybody to come, right? But they haven't said anything, and filling a visa form is really the last thing I want to do at this moment. But thank you for the invite. Aditya Sri Krishnan says, congratulations on 50. Absolutely love South Central and I never miss an episode. Good job, Aditya. Really enjoyed the episode discussing the Election Commission's credibility crisis. That's the one with Supriya Sharma. And Supriya's reels went so viral, I told her, do it more for Scroll. She's editor of Scroll. And the one on Vijay Mallya. Oh, that's the one we had Sucheta Dalal. Yes. And a favorite guest would be Miriam Joseph. Miriam is a member of WCC. She's a filmmaker. Thank you that you enjoyed all these episodes. Aditya says the couple of episodes on TVK, which is Vijay's party, was also great. It was enjoyable to hear widely differing views on Vijay's potential as a leader among TNM journalists. That is Shabir and me. Obviously, we differ a lot on that.
What is IIRC?
I don't know. What is IRC? We have to
some short form or something.
I am very bad at the abbreviations. So my former boss, IIRC is if I remember correctly, if I recall correctly. So my former boss, he'll say, the nation wants to know. So he once sent me a text in the night saying FYI. Those times only messages were there. So I texted back saying, sorry, but what is FYI? He was so angry with me saying, are you making fun of me? I said, no, I genuinely do not understand abbreviations. Okay, Prahlad Murli. Hi TNM team, hope all of you are doing well. I've been a happy subscriber for the past week. Congratulations, Prahlad. Please open and read Sudipto's story first, then go and read these stories and read lots of other stories behind paywall. And everybody, be like Prahlad, take a subscription. I want to thank you for consistently maintaining such high standards in journalism. I have one request regarding the recent Women's World Cup victory. Could you please consider a special episode on South Central? It would be wonderful if you could bring in Sharada Ugra for the discussion. We already had a South Central without it, but Prahlad, we are going to have Let Me Explain, hosted by me this week on Women's World Cup. I don't know if I'm going to make much sense, but do look at that. We did ask for Sharada's inputs before we wrote that script. Maybe we'll have a discussion next week. Bhuvan would love it. Maybe Bhuvan should sit for the discussion and not me.
Yeah, he plays cricket also.
Yeah, he's a cricket champion. Okay, Mohammad Umair. Hi South Central team. I loved the episode on Umar Khalid. The guest Shahrukh ma'am had put the case succinctly and her eloquence was addictive. Yes, I absolutely love Shahrukh Alam. And as I said in the episode also, much better than Shahrukh Khan. I love Pooja Prasanna the most. I watched her first time on News Laundry when you people were doing election coverage in Karnataka. Her way of speaking, her humor, her nuanced perspectives and her LME episodes. Big fan of hers. Pooja, I tune to every episode of South Central and I wish the podcast all the very best. Okay. Thank you, Umair. Two more letters. Manan Shah says, "Hi Dhanya." Manan writes frequently. I met him at Media Rumble also. He's talking about Dashwant. It's a very long email. So he says we often ignore realities of the police, politicians, bureaucrats and judiciary and go on with our lives thinking how does it matter, or just accept what it is and try to figure out our own lives. So he says the article that Sukanya had written on the Dashwant case was an eye-opener. Not that he had any faith in Indian judiciary. This case completely voided me of any trust in Indian society, polity or judiciary. So in the letter he says, I feel bad even for Dashwant. Let's assume for a second that he is in fact innocent, which is not a stretch, given that the Supreme Court has declared so. He was not provided a lawyer for weeks. He has been completely abused in the media and on the basis of no evidence. Forget even reasonable doubts. Human rights are another joke in this country. In all this, I think the biggest criminals are the people of India. Criminal negligent, multiple generations of ancestors fought for independence. The Indian state has abandoned all its responsibilities towards citizens and there's no one willing to oppose it. This is not only Modi or RSS making, even Congress and all political parties are equally responsible. Modi just happened to consolidate it. So lots of thoughts put into one email, Manan. I don't want to talk about whether Dashwant was innocent or not because I have very strong beliefs about it, which I don't think is fair to thrust on the listeners. But yeah, I think being complicit is a problem not just for the Indian public, it is a problem for the Indian media also. In fact, I tell my colleagues here, anybody who's been working for 3-4 years, that the moment you stop feeling outraged about anything, that means you've become cynical. And this is not the job for you. You have to leave. You have to feel outrage each time. Yes, it is a lot of, energy that you have to use, a lot of emotions, but this job calls for it, right? Same, I think, applies for citizens.
I would like to say that, to Manan that, okay, don't give up faith so easily.
I thought you were going to tell me that you don't feel outraged anymore.
No. I feel outraged all the time. I just keep quiet about it.
You shouldn't. Okay, finally, I'll read a letter, very, very critical, by Arvind Tyagarajan. Arvind writes long critical letters and I meet him in person and I explain to him because I can't write back long emails. He's a subscriber for a long time. He is criticizing the episode on the movie thing, which you are also there with Shiv Sundar, about how the tickets for the movies have to be curtailed, right? The ticket prices. He said the conversation becomes intellectually poor. One doesn't need a shouting match. But the conversations become intellectually poor when so many obvious rebuttals go missing on a topic as broad as cinemas. The episode once again missed having a panelist in favor of the government keeping its hands off from fixing prices. See, in my defense, one of the panelists who we invited, I thought that he would perhaps talk about tickets not being so low, the producer, but then he didn't. He was also as communist as anybody could get. In my defense, Arvind, if you take it or not. So Arvind is saying that comparing Karnataka and Tamil Nadu is like apples and oranges when it comes to movie culture. The government in Tamil Nadu since independence has been a primary stakeholder of its state cinema. It is not as black and white as the Tamil audience care for its movie-going. Tamil Nadu governments care for its movie-going audience. He says ticket pricing is not set in isolation. It's a function of the overall arrangement between producers, distributors and theatre owners. If they set the price too high, they shall miss out an audience. Basically, posh multiplexes in Bangalore are selling Kantara tickets for the first day at $350 or $400. Since single theatres are selling first day shows at 250 rupees, I worry why this was even a topic. He's like, why is this even a topic for South Central?
Because entertainment is a fundamental right, and it was the UN had some commission in the 1980s which also upheld the same thing.
Oh, he's going to write, Arvind, please write to Anisha at thenewsminute.com. Anyway, Arvind's final thing, which I agree with, I urge you to have different voices on your podcast for the podcast's sake. As a subscriber, I already know what you both have to say on various topics. What? I'm going to really surprise you, Arvind, next time by saying something very different from what you imagine I will say. I want tickets to be 1,000 rupees. I'd like the podcast to become richer through civil exchange of a variety of ideas, especially with those whom you may not agree with necessarily. I take that feedback very, very seriously, and trust me, I keep thinking of people, but the civil conversation is the problem. The lying is the problem. Now, when you lie, this conversation cannot become civil after a point of time. But I will try my best, Arvind. And he has a small note for me. If you want to watch Oppenheimer, which I had mentioned in the episode, you're already an elite in our country. Forget the pricing.
But he has a point.
Yeah, but like final take by Arvind. Thank you very much, everyone, for all the letters. Thank you for listening to South Central. We hope we will reach 100 episodes, 150 episodes, etc. But nothing is possible without our subscribers pitching in. So do become a subscriber or contribute to any of the reporting funds. Thank you to Bhuvan Malik, our producer, who has given shape to South Central, who very patiently sits and tells me how to change things. Sometimes I may listen, sometimes I may not, but Bhuvan is very consistent and if you've met Bhuvan, very peaceful. He will not say anything loudly, but there will be that smirk and smile when he's giving you a suggestion. Yeah, it's still there on his face as he's watching us. Thank you, Ajay, who is our dedicated production assistant for putting together the studio all the time. Thank you, Jasim Ali, who has listened to my sound multiple times every week when he's editing this. Pooja Prasanna, who's not here. Leena Raghunath, our first co-host, who had to leave the show because she joined Himal Mag. Thank you to Yana, Sukanya Shaji, and Maria Teresa Raju, who used to be the ears of this show. Thank you everyone for listening in. Till next week. Okay, so before we say the final goodbye, recommendations very quickly.
So this is something which I strongly recommend. This is a book which is titled Accelerating India's Development, a State-Led Roadmap of Effective Governance by Karthik Muralidharan. I think it's a must read for every bureaucrat, every politician, and everyone who is involved in public policy making in India. It's a real eye opener. It just came out this year in the month of March. So I highly recommend this book for anybody who has interest in public policy in India. And a couple of other books which I found interesting, which is Breaking the Mold by Raghuram Rajan, Reimagining India's Economic Future, a fantastic read. And again, another one which is very relevant for today's discussion. Again, another book by Dr. Raghuram Rajan, which is The Third Pillar, How Markets and the State Leave the Community Behind. I think this would be my recommendations, and these are all very recent books. So those are my to read lists.
My recommendation is a book called The Anthropologist. I'm just reading this now. It's about young adults who move to a foreign city, which is very much applicable for me, and set against the backdrop of apartment hunting and daily life in the foreign city. So yeah, I mean, I'm yet to get through it, but it's been good so far.
I have this recommendation. I knew about this case, but I've never heard the podcast. Seema Chishti of The Wire, she heard my recommendation from the Tortoise podcast about that crime podcast about the teacher who was in love or who had sex with a teenager. So she told me to listen to the serial The Alibi, which is Adnan Shah's case. It's covered a lot. It's an old podcast, 2014 podcast done by New York Times. I'm hooked to it. It's got 12 episodes. I finished 6 now. It had 350 million downloads, that podcast. That podcast started the Innocence Project, which basically looks at people who are convicted and how they're innocent. It's really fantastic. In fact, the journalist who did that was nominated as one of Time Magazine's 150 most powerful people in the world. So you should listen to that podcast. Yeah, Anisha, what is your recommendation?
Nothing even a fraction as heavy. I was listening to this artist called Leela Aiki this morning. She's super cool, and I would urge everybody to listen to her music. It brings to mind summer as we head into winter. I hate winter. So yeah, hope.
What? You want to remember summer?
Yeah, man. I like summer. I like heat and humidity.
Okay. So that's all on this week's South Central. Come back for the next episode.